if you were to guess, how many tests are there live now, today at Vinted?
I would say hundreds, but
Okay.
maybe not exactly like how many.
Okay, but that sounds cool, and that sounds
Yeah.
like a pretty, well, one of the bigger experimentation programs, but definitely not like the giants.
Yeah.
And how many teams do you think are experimenting in Vinted?
So I would say majority, especially product-facing teams.
Yeah.
But now we're also thinking in terms of how to get other teams which are like more like infrastructure based or more
Yeah.
backend based, so that they also get into the habit of actually releasing their changes via experiments.
Welcome on the show, Giedrius. And imagine we have never met. Where could I potentially know you from? And what's the thing you're exceptionally good at in the experimentation space?
I have a background in like statistics, also background like in data science world. So I wouldn't say that I'm exceptionally good at one particular place. I'm more generalist. Now,
You're a PhD. What did you do your research in?
yeah, so actually I would say my graduate studies was where I first got acquainted with experimentation. So it wasn't like A/B testing per se, but it was more about looking for natural experiments. So I specialized in labor economics, and I think the first paper which I have read, which hooked me on kind of about this experimentation topic, was this work by Angrist and Kruger. So it was like 30 plus years ago. And what they looked at was how the quarter of birth affects earnings. And that sounds a bit strange, but basically they used the quarter of birth as what's called like an instrument for education. And then they could answer this question of how education affects earnings. It's a very interesting question from the public policy as well, because lots of time and money is spent on education. And so the question if it's worth investing additional resources, additional years. And in theory, I guess you could use like statistics and data to see if you get additional education, like how much additional learnings you will get. But the problem is that it's not an easy answer, because there are some theories of education as a signaling. So the idea is basically you get additional years of education just to signal your ability, and what's driving earnings is not your additional education, but basically your ability. So if we just look at years of schooling and earnings, we would get potentially this what's called spurious correlation, because people who are good at getting degrees, maybe they are good also at getting more money in the labor market. And basically this idea of actually using quarter of birth was that, so it was the data on the US, and the observation there was that people who are born around like at the 6 years of age, people like who are born in January and later actually go to the preschool, but if you're born before January, then you can enter school. And also, so people are actually born around January and December are pretty similar, except that one can go to school and another one has to wait another year. But at the same time, you can finish school after, I think, at around 16 or something like that, and then just do whatever you want, or you can continue with education. But so for people who actually are on the margin, should they get more schooling or not, this entering to school earlier gives you an additional year of education by force, in a sense. And so you can use then this variation and basically just then estimate this additional schooling effect on earnings. This was the first paper I remember which talked about natural experiments, and actually lots of papers which I read were looking for these natural experiments or instruments, trying to get this what's called the causal impact, so the actual impact, not just the correlational observation. And the reason why students and researchers spend so much time looking for these variations is that you cannot really do an actual experiment with people. In some cases, people do experiments like that. For example, there's randomization by school districts or by state, but then these experiments are typically very costly. And comparing to what, for example, with the experimentation Vinted, where it's almost cost-free. Like you can run experiments with millions of users, members, and then it doesn't cost you much.
So it doesn't cost too much, but it might. Would you also say it's easier to experiment at Vinted than in the real world?
Yeah, so you could say that the real world is really complex. And for example, these natural experiments like causal impact studies, people have to spend a lot of effort trying to convince basically that what they're estimating is the real causal effect. And the idea is that, like with the experimentation, you would ideally like to observe like two different outcomes with the intervention and without for the same person. But you can observe only one outcome. So let's say if you got an additional year of schooling, you cannot observe what would have been your earnings in the case you didn't, right? And like with this literature typical in academia is that then you have to build a really convincing what's called counterfactual kind of, so that people who got an additional year of schooling and they didn't, they should be the same, except for the fact that they got this additional year of schooling. Well, with this large-scale experimentation like at Vinted, then it's easy to convince people because people are the same in two different like A/B test groups, except one group got the treatment and another didn't, and the treatment could be anything, change in the AI, change in the ranking algorithm, maybe like an email notification or anything like that. And since we're randomizing across millions of people, like on average, these two groups are the same, except for the intervention, and then it's a really convincing case that the difference which we measure is because of that change.
So in fact, you have been running experiments for years, decades maybe. What is it that still makes you passionate about experimentation? What drives you today?
So I guess I'm interested in these difficult methodological questions. And I think at Vinted, I have been working in experimentation team for, it's now my 4th year. But still, the questions remain. And some places experimentation is easier and others more difficult. And I guess one of the difficulties with experimenting at Vinted is that it's a marketplace. So we have both buyers and listers and sellers. And the intervention then typically might affect the buyers, sellers, or both. And then there's also competition between buyers for the same resources, competition between sellers for buyers' attention, like views and so forth. So basically, all of these complications add, all of these things add complication to how to actually measure the true effect. So because we get what's called interference bias.
Are there specific methods that you use currently to fix this then? Do you just split them or?
One thing which we do is occasionally, like for the features where we might expect this kind of competition bias, then we run like what's called this like rollouts studies, basically where we try to expose bigger and bigger population of, let's say, of buyers and sellers, and then see if the estimated effect changes or not. And if it does, then it indicates that there is a competition bias, or like what's called also interference bias. But it's also a question, like when you're testing for a feature, you could decide, do you actually run an experiment by randomizing buyer experience or by randomizing seller experience, and like based on different assumptions, then you might get like different results, because on that one side the bias might be larger than the other. So basically we need to think about all of these things and then thinking about experiment design.
Do you try to balance both, or are you currently optimizing more for one group than the other?
So it is easier to experiment on the buyer side because there are more buyers than sellers at Vinted. So basically we get larger sample sizes, but then also the bias you get from this interference might be bigger. So it's, if possible, then we try to experiment on both sides.
And do you do that at the same time?
It is possible to experiment on both sides simultaneously, like actually randomize them independently, but that increases the complexity. So it's just easier to run more experiments and quicker and just do one and the other one and not overcomplicate the setup.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, and so we spoke a little bit about how you came from academia and ended up in experimentation. Was your first job in like digital experimentation at Vinted, or did you start A/B testing and work with experimentation before?
No, actually, my first job on this large-scale experimentation was at Vinted, so I got straight into the kind of experimentation team, and
Yeah.
helping other teams to both to design experiments, automate analysis, think about kind of statistical improvements of how to get more precise results by running their experiments and these kind of
Okay.
problems.
And so when you started at Vinted, what did their experimentation program look like at that time?
When I started at Vinted, the experimentation program was like, I think, 1 year old. Vinted, people at Vinted, teams at Vinted actually have been experimenting before, even like from the start of the organization. So I think it was like more than 10 years ago. And the experimentation was quite common. But then 5 years or so ago, Vinted started growing really fast, and it has been growing fast. And more and more people have been joining the company, and the new people which joining not necessarily were like having the same experience of experimentation-driven development and like culture. It became more and more necessary actually to have a more formal experimentation program and team so that we can onboard everyone, teach everyone about experimentation, like running workshops, also spend a lot of effort on actually building the culture of experimentation. So it was, as I said, 1 year old, and yeah.
So at the point where Vinted started to grow, that's when experimentation also became more important, it sounds.
Yeah, it's actually, it's much easier to experiment when you have a large user base, because then your experiments basically are shorter, so you get an answer quicker, and you can get more precision in a sense. So even if, for example, if you want more precision, you can run a bit longer experiment, but then you can differentiate impacts of 5% point or something like that. And that might not sound like much, but the scale of Vinted, it still adds up. So it's even these small changes are important. And also, as Vinted kind of gets more and more optimized in many areas, and it becomes more difficult to have these additional gains from experimentations. Then even the small impacts are important.
And when you started at Vinted, what were the first challenges you tackled? Were those challenges focused on data quality or more about the culture? Where did you start?
So the first job, which kind of the whole experimentation team tried to tackle, was metric standardization.
Okay.
Because, it's important to have metrics standardized, both in a sense so that everyone's, measuring, kind of focusing on the same thing, but also if they measure the same thing, call it the same way.
Right.
And also when you define metrics, kind of we spend a lot of effort in terms of collecting this like meta information about what does this metric mean, what are its properties, and like so that people actually, when they see the result, can understand what this means.
Have you invented any metrics that are specific to Vinted? Like I can remember working at a big online media website where we created a metric that would take into consideration the scroll depth with how long people stayed on the page to estimate better if people would actually read it and what the quality of reading was. Are you coming up or inventing metrics by combining them at all, or are they pretty regular? Someone has bought a product, for example.
I don't know. We have like now more than 1,000 metrics standardized, so it's, of course, some of these metrics are quite Vinted specific, I would say. I don't think I could give you like particular examples. I think there are variations in metrics which are coming from the technical side. Yeah. So we do have an experimentation platform what's called like triggering or exposure events, and that's basically focusing on the users which are affected by the feature as to have more precise measurement. And then, for example, you could have a metric which measures user activity like transactions or revenue and so forth during the whole experiment duration, or only since the user was triggered or exposed to the experiment. And like there are merits of using both versions, and we have both versions and people can select which version to use. This is just an example of kind of this technical metric. But
okay, so the first step was metrics. What came after that?
So at the same time, as with metrics, was the kind of focus on experimentation culture. So we did spend quite a few resources actually to get the automation part, so that it's easy basically to, once the metrics are set up, it's easy to add the metrics, start the experiment, and then see the results. But the hard part was actually to, I don't know, incentivize people to actually run experiments. Vinted has quite a big office and headquarters at Vilnius, and Vilnius is like a capital of a small, relatively small country of Lithuania. So there aren't many other companies which actually experiment in Lithuania. I think Vinted is quite an exception. So when you hire a lot of people, new people, they're not used to the experimentation way of working.
Yeah.
And you might be used, for example, to come into the team and looking for directions of, okay, so what should I develop next, and so forth. And experimentation kind of approach is completely different. Instead of thinking in terms of hypothesis, you think in terms of member behavior, and then you try to come up with quick ways actually to test these hypotheses and develop features. And when you build roadmaps, you want to build like this, instead of after this I build this and this and that. But with experimentation, you should instead try to think in terms of, okay, I built this quick feature, I run an experiment. If experiment successful, I go there. If not, I go there. So it's not like a linear path anymore. So you have a lot of choices in a sense. So it's a different way of development. And so it's both kind of a challenge to the product people, to the product manager, but also like to engineers in terms of how do I develop, knowing that maybe my feature will not be successful. Because engineers typically like kind of this, they get the requirements and they develop like what's required, right? And that's not how development should work with experimentation. So it's more like we try something, we test it with data, it doesn't work, we move on. Maybe we iterate with a different version, maybe we abandon the idea and we try another idea. And actually the faster you can iterate, the bigger the chances of success, because you will find something which works instead of developing a feature, I don't know, for a quarter, for half a year, for the year. Then after you develop it, test it with the test. And what if the A/B test shows you that the feature, it doesn't really add anything, like no revenue, maybe it's a negative feature. So then the whole year of development is lost. So that's not the way to operate if you actually have a, I would say, advantage of A/B testing, because then you have, it's in a sense, it's a much safer development because you can develop it in small iterations. You can test it out, like making sure there's no unintended bad effects, and then we move on. So the team has to learn. So in changing this experimentation culture in a sense that the team is willing to do this way. And then, of course, once the teams who start experimenting, then there is no need to convince them anymore. So they actually see the benefits, because the A/B test gives them the kind of the answer, like, is what they develop, is it good or not? But like for the other teams who haven't had a lot of experiments before, then it's like a different way of working, and then it's hard a bit to start.
So you would say that first step, going from not testing to running the first experiment, is the hardest one?
I would say it's the hardest one, both learning of how to do it, but also shifting your mindset a bit in terms of, like how do you approach feature development and testing.
And how is that now? Is everyone experimenting, or there are probably still challenges and teams to work on, I can imagine?
The velocity of experimentation at Vinted is much higher than it was 2 years ago or even a year ago. So we had a almost like exponential growth in experiments. But we're still not there, let's say, with some other industry leaders in experimentation, which run the order of magnitude more of experiments. And it's a long tail. So there are teams which run a lot of experiments and they iterate fast. And some teams don't run a lot of experiments yet. So for teams which didn't have like experiments, the minimum which we asked them to do is run an AA experiment. So
it's a good start.
So just AA experiments is basically where you don't change anything, but pretend that there's something changing, right? Just making sure that I understand how to set up exposure events, how to look at the results and so forth.
So that's the first thing you ask teams to do, just to set up an AA test?
Yeah, so it's more for engineers to be comfortable with how the code should look like with the feature switches.
And do you have your own tool, or do you use a third-party tool to build experiments?
So there are some teams who use external tools, but most of the experimentation is done with in-house tooling.
Okay.
So basically we had a feature flag solution from years ago, and then we built experimentation on top of it, but then there were some limitations, so now actually rebuilding it. So engineers are working on feature flagging and experimentation as one package, and we're still in the process of moving to the new internal platform, but yeah, we're getting there. So some new experiments already running on the new platform as well.
And how do you manage all the learnings of all the teams experimenting? So if one team uses a different tool and the other team focuses on something else, is there like a platform that is shared where all the learnings from experiments are documented?
So we do have experimentation you can call like a database where all the learnings should be documented, but I guess the problem is a bit with the compliance. And there's some a bit of replication of teams, for example, like reporting their own description of the experiments or analysis, like in Google Docs or like conference pages and so forth. So we're still in the process of trying to both make it more centralized and also make it more convenient for the team so that they don't have to copy paste everything in multiple places. There are learnings available, but it could be better. So in the process of actually making it more
because that's
easy to find.
Yeah. It probably makes it hard to do like meta-analysis. For example, find all the tests ever done around, I don't know, social proof or showing the buyer versus seller. Yeah. Or do you have a method of filtering out tests?
So we have done some meta-analysis before, but then it becomes a bit limited in terms of what kind of information you can gather from the experiment. Like actually the first thing which then we started to do in meta-analysis, it became clear that we would not necessarily know what was the standardization based upon, like buyers or sellers or both and so forth. So see what kind of information was missing and started collecting it. So now we are more in the better place of doing some meta-analysis and meta-learning in terms of what has been experimented upon.
Would you say that's still the biggest challenge today, or is that building your own experimentation platform or something else?
So it's a little bit of everything, I would say. Like we are in a pretty good place, but we can improve in many places at the same time. So both kind of making the analysis simpler, because at the moment it's most of the kind of results interpretation is done by like decision scientists, and we would like it to be more friendly among all functions, so that like even an engineer or like a product person could by himself or herself look at the results and understand like what they mean. So we need to improve on this usability. There's also kind of new teams or new people joining Vinted still as we're growing, so onboarding is still an issue, and we spend quite a bit of time trying to talk about. We have run a workshop with people, with actually the whole team of including whole functions like engineering, design, data, product people, like sitting in the same room and then actually going through historical examples of how to set up hypotheses, how to select metrics, like how to interpret what decision support is going. And this actually was very useful, because then it demystifies the experimentation and the whole thing about metric selection and so forth. Like everyone in the team then can add something, because typically it's good to have like both engineering perspective, design perspective, and so forth, and they might suggest which assumptions about the A/B test we should check, what kind of metrics we should include, maybe something about latency or something about like user behavior and so forth. So not only these core business metrics like transactions or revenue or click-through rate and things like that.
Yeah. And did you at one point in time have to convince higher management to get more resources or to support experimentation in any way, or was that always already set?
So I would say there is different level among management, like in terms of the excitement about experimentation.
Okay.
Like in general, top management is actually very pro-experimentation and very excited, because this is a data-driven way, and this is, I would say, the cheapest and the fastest way to learn about user behavior and how successful not successful feature is. But there are like different, I guess some resistance comes from different functions. Let's say if you are doing some kind of technical change, like engineering-driven change, how do you convince your engineers you should A/B test? Because they would argue that this is incurring technical debt, it says adding additional time and so forth. But of course, the convincing head of the story should be that with the experiment, it's the safest way to release the feature because you can test it on users and make sure nothing wrong happens.
Yeah.
But there's still some convincing to be done. So it argues there's some both like pro-experimentation people, but also some people who still need to be convinced.
Yeah, no, I see. And when you think about the time you got into Vinted, did you make any mistakes that you can share with us so we can learn from it? Was there anything that you think back on and you think, okay, I've done that like that 3 years ago, but today I would do that differently?
Okay. I haven't thought about my mistakes. Well, not my mistakes per se, but like the experimentation mistakes.
I can tell you one of mine to
Okay.
give you some space to think. So when I started experimenting like 10 years ago, there was not that much knowledge about that out there. I know for sure, like many of my first experiments were underpowered. We would work with 500 users in each variant and then draw a conclusion from that. So that's, for example, something I did, but that was like 10 years ago.
I think, yeah, I don't know, trying to make sure that experiments are properly powered is a hard topic still for Vinted. So some teams have no issue with that because they, for example, experiment at the homepage where tens of millions of people visit the homepage. So it's easy for them basically to have a well-powered experiment, but some teams might need to experiment in some product area which is less frequently visited. Or for example, experimenting with a moderation platform where you have a limited number of moderators and so forth. So it's much more difficult to experiment. And then it's a question in terms of what do you do? Do you run less and long experiments? Do you look at the metrics which are not necessarily directly related to business, but maybe more sensitive and so forth? I think there was quite a bit of push to run a lot of experiments and look at this kind of these business related metrics so that actually people focus on what matters most, but that created quite a few underpowered experiments. So I guess we still I don't know. So in terms of the mistakes, I think we spend a lot of time in terms of standardizing metrics. I guess one of them would be actually to maybe we could have spent more time in terms of trying to look and think about metrics sooner. So at the moment we actually teams have on their roadmaps actually for different domains, for different teams to select the metrics they should focus on, so that these metrics are consistent across experiments, and they also like both relevant and also sensitive enough to run the experiments with. But that wasn't the case 2 or 3 years ago. So team might select a different metric for each different experiment, but then the issue is like how do you judge the overall success, let's say per quarter or per year of the team, like which metric do you use? Because then maybe the metric you want to choose to judge the team on, it's insignificant for most experiments. And then does it mean that the team hasn't done anything good? Maybe not, maybe yes, you don't know. So then it's difficult to make the teams accountable at the same time. And from the other perspective, it's difficult then to motivate the teams so that kind of to show the results they achieved.
Interesting. And if you were to guess, how many tests are there live now today at Vinted?
I would say hundreds, but maybe not exactly like how many.
Okay, but that sounds cool, and that sounds like a pretty, well, one of the bigger experimentation programs, but definitely not like the giants.
Yeah.
And how many teams do you think are experimenting in Vinted?
So I would say majority, especially product-facing teams.
Yeah.
But now we're also thinking in terms of how to get other teams which are like more like infrastructure based or more backend based, so that they also get into the habit of actually releasing their changes via experiments.
Yeah. And we've talked about what type of metrics for successful experiments there are, but do you also have a metric to measure the success of the experimentation program as a whole? How do you know if you're on the right track?
This is a very good question, and actually this is a question we started tackling. So recently we hired like a product manager for experimentation team, so to make us accountable as well. So far, like what we have been looking at was just a number of experiments the teams run, trying to make it larger in a sense, to increase incentives, and also in terms of impact, so that teams actually run impactful experiments. Yeah. But it's a bit further down the road in a sense. It doesn't depend only on the experimentation team, so it's more indirect. So we have been actually looking for metrics and thinking about metrics, like what metrics we can measure our success on. And one of the metrics which we are currently implementing is basically the daily active users in the platform, like in terms of how many people come and either set up experiments or look at the results and so forth. So we would like more and more people to be involved. So that would be one of the metrics.
So there was, I forgot her name, someone from HelloFresh that shared in a talk recently that they measure the time to decision of their experimentation program, which I also found very interesting. But I think all the measures that you share, like the amount of tests, daily active users, those are also very, very good metrics.
Yeah, time to decision is also one of the metrics which we want to start tracking, but we haven't implemented it yet.
Yeah, I can imagine it's a little bit more complicated than just measuring the users in your tool. Just as a last question then, do you think that experimentation is only for tech giants? It's only for brands like Vinted? Or can you also do experimentation for smaller brands? What's your take?
I would say it's 50-50. I think experimentation might sound exciting, but if you don't have the traffic, then it might get disappointed. So sometimes getting the wrong result is worse than having no result at all. And if you run an underpowered experiment, then you are risking to get these what's called false positives, where it sounds like an exciting result, but maybe just a noise, just random, and then you might focus on wrong things. So in these cases, I would argue that there are other signals which you can use, like actually user research, looking at time trends, and so forth, using these quasi-experimental methods. So getting not over-exciting about experimentation, but I think even for smaller companies, they should try to experiment as much as possible, actually, just to make sure that the things, they don't hurt customers. So you can make sure that you're not hurting your metrics. So that's also possible. But of course, the more users and more traffic you get, the bigger the benefits, because you can run experiments basically faster and more often. Yeah,
no, definitely. Thank you so much for our talk today. I really enjoyed talking about Vinted. I'm actually a big user of Vinted. Love the product that you guys are building. And it was great to get a little bit of an insight into what you're building there and what your challenges are. So thank you for that.